Wyoming Territory, late January. High in the unforgiving ridges of the Snowhorn Mountains, the wind was howling like a wounded beast, a relentless, soul-stealing sound that promised death to anything left exposed. But the first sound that caught Silas Granger's ear, a sound that cut through the wind's familiar, mournful cry, was not the storm. It was the sharp, high-pitched, and utterly desolate wail of something smaller, more fragile, and far more broken. He pulled his sturdy mountain horse to a stop, the animal's hooves crunching through the deep, wind-scoured snow. He tilted his head, his face shielded by a low-brimmed, snow-dusted hat, and listened. There it was again, a baby's cry. No, he realized with a jolt that went deeper than the cold. It was multiple cries, a thin, desperate chorus of misery. He narrowed his eyes and dismounted, his movements economical and sure, the practiced grace of a man who had spent a lifetime in the wild. The narrow game trail he was following hadn't been ridden in days. It cut through the dense, snow-laden pines like a fresh scar on old, weathered skin. His heavy, fur-lined boots sank ankle-deep with each deliberate step as he led his horse by the reins, his breath visible in sharp white puffs in the frigid air. The sound grew louder, more desperate, as he approached a small clearing near an old fence post, a relic from a long-dead homesteader, now half-rotted and half-buried in a deep snowdrift. And there she was, a woman, barely upright, tied cruelly to the post with a length of rusted barbed wire. Her arms were bound tightly behind her, the skin of her forearms torn and bleeding where she had struggled. Snow clung to her lashes and the edges of her dark, tangled hair, which was now frozen in place against her temples. Her lips were cracked and blue, her face as pale as the deathly snow around her, save for the ugly, violent bruises that bloomed like frozen purple violets across her cheekbones. At her feet, nestled in the snow, were three small, tightly wrapped bundles. Infants. Newborns no older than a day, their tiny faces red and raw from the biting cold. One whimpered weakly, the sound that had drawn him here. The other two lay terrifyingly silent, wrapped in what looked like the shredded, blood-stained remains of a simple cotton nightgown. The woman's head moved slightly. She was conscious, barely. Her eyes, when they fluttered open, were clouded with pain and the dull, exhausted resignation of a soul that had given up the fight. But as they focused on him, a flicker of something, a final, desperate ember of maternal fire, ignited within them. Don't let them take my daughters," she whispered, her voice a dry, rasping sound, almost lost in the howl of the wind. Silas dropped to one knee beside her without a moment's hesitation, the years of self-imposed, bitter solitude instantly forgotten in the face of this profound and brutal injustice. He pulled off his thick leather gloves and with a gentleness that belied his rough appearance, he checked each of the babies. Their breathing was shallow, almost imperceptible, but it was steady. Their skin was cold, the dangerous, creeping kind of cold that traveled deep into the bone and didn't let go. "You're coming with me," he said, his voice a low, steady, and certain rumble against the storm's fury. It wasn't an offer. It was a vow. She blinked slowly, as if it took a monumental effort for her to register the words, to process an act of kindness in a world that had just shown her its ultimate cruelty. He took a heavy skinning knife from the sheath on his boot, and with a single powerful slice, he cut the barbed wire that bound her. It had bitten deep into the raw flesh of her forearms, and fresh blood, dark and sluggish, welled where the rusted steel tore free. But she did not scream. She did not even flinch. As her legs finally gave out, he wrapped his arms around her waist to hold her steady. Her body was limp, a dead weight, heavy with exhaustion, exposure, and blood loss. Silas did not hesitate. He scooped her up, a surprisingly light burden, and cradled her against his broad chest. Then, he went for the babies. One by one, he gathered the three small, silent bundles. He tucked the smallest ones inside his heavy coat, against the warmth of his own body, and secured them using a thick wool blanket he unstrapped from his saddle. They barely stirred. The wind picked up again, a fresh, vicious gust that sliced across the open, exposed space. He shielded them all with his body as best he could, his horse nickering anxiously nearby. Silas glanced toward the horizon, at the endless, unforgiving expanse of white. They had a half a mile back to his cabin, uphill, through snow that was now coming down in a thick, blinding curtain. He adjusted his grip on the woman, whose name he would learn was Marabel, tightened the wrap on the infants, and whispered, not to her, not to the babies, maybe to the wind, or maybe to the ghost of the wife he had failed. "You don't die here," he vowed. "Not on my land." He mounted his horse with a practiced, careful strength, keeping her in front of him, the babies tucked securely between them. She weighed next to nothing. The infants were lighter than winter rabbits. The cold had drained them all of their life force, and time was not their friend. The trail back was a slow, agonizing blur of white. The wind was a relentless physical assault, but Silas, a man who had been running from his own past for 3 long years, moved with the unwavering purpose of a man who had finally found something worth running towards. There was no time to ask who she was or what demons had chased her to this desolate place. There was only time enough to keep her and her children alive. The cabin was dark when they finally reached it, the fire long gone cold, the interior as frigid as a tomb. Silas kicked open the door, carried her straight inside, and laid her gently on his own bed, a simple cot piled high with quilts near the hearth. The babies came next. He set them in a large wicker basket he used for firewood, lining it first with his softest rabbit pelts, and then turned to stoke the dying embers in the fireplace with hands that did not shake. Not yet. Outside, the snow continued to fall, a silent white shroud covering the tracks, the blood, and the memory of the crime that had been committed at the old fence post. Inside, Silas worked by the growing firelight, a silent, certain, and solitary figure. A stranger and her 3 children had been left to die on his mountain, but not here, not tonight, not on his land. As the warmth from the fire began to push back the bone-deep chill, he turned his full attention to the infants. They were beginning to stir, their whimpers low and weak, but alive. He gently unwrapped the smallest, a girl whose face was a perfect, tiny miniature of her mother's. As he adjusted the worn blanket, his thumb brushed against her ankle, and he froze. There, on the delicate skin of her tiny ankle, was a small, unique birthmark, the unmistakable shape of a crescent moon. His breath caught in his throat. It was the exact same birthmark, in the exact same place as his own Shoshone wife, who had died in a raid 3 years ago. The raid he had failed to prevent. The raid that had also taken his own infant son. He stared at the mark, his heart pounding a slow, heavy, and painful rhythm against his ribs. It couldn't be. A coincidence. A trick of the firelight and his own grieving mind. With a hand that now trembled, he checked the other 2 babies. The second girl had it as well. The third did not. He looked from the children to the unconscious woman on his cot, her dark hair, her high cheekbones, the proud, strong line of her jaw. He had been so focused on her injuries he had not truly seen her. He now realized with a dawning, world-altering certainty that Marabel must have Shoshone blood. His act of simple human mercy had just become intensely, terrifyingly personal. He saw in these 3 fragile infants a ghostly reflection of the family he had lost, a second chance he had never asked for and was not sure he deserved. Later, after he had fed the babies warmed goat's milk with a small carved spoon, Marabel finally stirred. Her voice was a cracked, barely audible whisper. "My name's Marabel. Marabel Quinn." "Silas," he said simply, his own voice rough with an emotion he could not name. Her eyes, clouded with pain, slipped from him to the basket of babies who were now resting quietly in the fire's gentle glow. One of them sneezed, the smallest one, a tiny human sound. Marabel's eyes flooded with tears, but she did not sob. A silent, heartbreaking stream simply ran down her cracked cheeks, her body too tired, too broken for anything more. He knew then that he had to know the truth. He had to know the story of their cruelty. "Joseph Quinn," she began, her voice a low, raw whisper. "He was my husband. He wanted a son, an heir to his name, to his land." She turned her face slightly, revealing the faint, old scar along her jawline. He was not a kind man. When the first daughter was born, he frowned. The second, he stopped speaking to me. The third, her voice finally broke, a single ragged sob tearing from her chest. When the third girl was born, he said I was cursed, said I was no better than a mule, useless if I could not give him a son. She took a shuddering breath. He said my blood was tainted, impure. Silas's jaw flexed once, tightly. He had a sudden, violent image of this man, Joseph Quinn, and what he would do to him if he ever laid eyes on him. "That night," she continued, "he and his brothers, they beat me. Then he dragged me to the old fence post and tied me there. Said if the snow did not take me, then I was meant to live. He called it God's justice. Her hands trembled as she spoke, one reaching instinctively toward the basket holding her daughters. They said girls are nothing but mouths to feed, she whispered, especially not half-breed girls. The truth, the final missing piece, was out. Half-breed. Shoshone. Silas looked at the birthmark on the sleeping child's ankle. He looked at Marabel's proud, strong, beautiful face, and he knew, with a certainty that settled deep in his bones, that his life of quiet, lonely penance was over. Joseph Quinn's cruelty was not just a random act of a brutal man. Silas, with his ranger's intuition, knew there had to be more to the story. Why leave her to die in this specific, remote location? It was a message. It was a claim. And Silas Granger, a man who had failed one Shoshone woman and her child, would not fail another. He would not fail these three. A fragile, brittle peace settled over the high mountain cabin in the days that followed the storm. It was a peace defined not by comfort, but by the shared, quiet, and relentless work of survival. The world outside was a vast, unforgiving expanse of white, the snowpack deep and the passes to the lowlands impassable. The cabin became their entire world, a small, warm island of life in a frozen, silent sea. Silas fell back into the familiar, solitary rhythms of his exile, but they were different now, punctuated by the small, demanding cries of the infants and the quiet, resilient presence of their mother. He felt his old, deep wounds, the wounds of his own failed family, beginning to ache with a new and unfamiliar tenderness as he cared for the three small girls. He saw his own lost son in their tiny, perfect features, his lost wife in their determined grip on life. This was not just charity, it was a painful and perhaps necessary haunting. Marabel healed slowly, her body knitting itself back together with the stubborn resilience of a woman who had refused to die. But a deeper healing was also taking place. In the quiet, non-judgmental space of Silas's cabin, she began to shed the layers of fear and shame that had been her only companions for so long. She saw the way Silas would gently cradle one of her daughters in his large, rough hands, his weathered face softening with a look of profound, sorrowful tenderness. She saw the way he would carve small, simple wooden toys for them in the evenings, a silent offering of a father's love. A deep, unspoken bond began to form between them, a bond forged not in words but in the shared, sacred duty of protecting these three small, miraculous lives. But the world outside, the world of men and their greed, was not content to leave them in their isolated peace. The first sign of the encroaching danger came in the form of Hattie, the sharp-eyed and sharp-tongued midwife from the town in the valley below. She was a woman who knew the mountains, and she made the treacherous, snow-choked journey to Silas's cabin as soon as the passes were even partially clear. She arrived one morning, her face grim, her breath fogging in the cold air. "Silas," she said, her voice clipped and urgent. "It's about her. About Quinn." Silas, who had been splitting wood, set his axe down, his face a mask of stone. Marabel, holding one of the babies, stood in the cabin doorway, her own face pale. "He's not just spreading lies," Hattie continued, her eyes darting nervously towards the trail behind her, as if she feared she had been followed. "He's telling folks she ran off in a fit of madness, that she's unstable. He's telling the law that the babies are his by right, and that she's stolen them, hiding them in secret against God and the law." Marabel's eyes widened, her fingers clenching around the infant in her arms. "He's hired men, Silas." Hattie's voice dropped to a low conspiratorial whisper. "4 of them, not local boys. Hard-faced men from the southern territories, the kind that ride with their guns tied down. He says they're just a rescue party, looking to bring a mother and her children back where they belong. But the way they ride, the way they carry themselves. Silas, it ain't no rescue party. It's a hunting party." Silas nodded once. That was all. He had been expecting this. Hattie looked between the two of them, at the 3 small cradles now lined up by the hearth, at the quiet domestic scene that had taken root in this wild place. "They'll find this place, Silas, sooner or later. And when they do, they won't take her," Silas said, his voice a low, flat promise. "And they won't take the girls." The midwife hesitated, then reached into her coat and pulled out a small leather pouch. "Dried lentils, jerky, a flask of good spirits," she said. "You'll need your strength." He accepted it with a silent nod of thanks. She left not long after, a brave, solitary figure riding back down into a world that was becoming increasingly hostile. The news, as dire as it was, acted not as a source of fear, but as a catalyst. The time for silent healing was over. The time for active preparation had begun. The threat forced Silas to finally, after 3 long years, break his own vow of silence. He knew he had to tell Marabel the full truth, not just of who he was, but of the history of blood and betrayal that was tied to this very land. That night, as the fire crackled and the 3 girls slept peacefully, he revealed his past. He told her he had been a Texas Ranger, a man who had lived by the gun and the law, and he told her of his wife, a proud and beautiful Shoshone woman named Tala, and of the small, mixed-blood son they had loved more than life itself. He told her of the raid, of the men who had come not for land or cattle, but for revenge, men who could not tolerate the sight of a white man living in peace with a native woman. And he told her of his own failure, of being away on a patrol when the attack came, of returning to find only ashes and silence. He took out the one thing he had left of her, the small, intricately beaded bracelet. "I came here to die, Marabel," he confessed, his voice raw with a grief that was still as fresh as an open wound. "But this mountain, this silence, it wouldn't let me." Marabel, in turn, her own eyes shining with unshed tears of empathy, confirmed what he had already suspected. She told him of her own Shoshone mother, a woman who had been cast out by her tribe for marrying a white trader. She told him of her own life spent hiding her heritage, of living in fear of the prejudice of a world that saw her as less than whole, a half-breed, a creature of 2 worlds who belonged to neither. And together, in the quiet, fire-lit intimacy of the cabin, they finally understood the full, monstrous scope of Joseph Quinn's plan. Marabel's inherited land, the land her father had left her, was not just a simple plot for farming. It bordered the sacred lands of the Shoshone, the very lands that were rumored to hold a legendary hidden gold cache. Joseph Quinn, a man consumed by a toxic mixture of greed and racial hatred, had married her not for love but for a legal claim to that land. When she had given birth not to a pure-blooded white male heir, but to 3 half-breed girls, his plan had been ruined. His brutal, murderous act of leaving them to die in the snow was not just an act of a cruel, disappointed husband. It was the cold, calculated act of a land speculator, an attempt to erase her and her impure children from the deed, from the world, so that he could claim the land as a grieving widower, free of any inconvenient native ties that might complicate his search for gold. He was not just a monster, he was a strategic, patient, and utterly ruthless one. And he was coming. The siege, when it came, was not a direct, thunderous assault, but a slow, cruel, and methodical tightening of a noose. Joseph Quinn was a patient man, a speculator who understood the value of letting an asset weaken before moving in for the final acquisition. He and his 4 hired guns, a collection of hard-faced men with dead eyes and tied-down pistols, made their camp at the base of the single, snow-choked mountain trail, effectively cutting off the cabin from the rest of the world. They did not attack, they simply waited, their presence a constant menacing promise of the violence to come. They would let the mountain's own harshness, the biting wind, the dwindling supplies, and the gnawing, ever-present fear do their work for them. They would break their spirits before they broke down their door. But Quinn had made a critical and ultimately fatal miscalculation. He was facing not a simple, grieving homesteader, but a haunted ex-Texas Ranger. And Silas Granger was no longer a man running from his past. He was a man fighting for a future that now held the faces of Marabel and her 3 small, impossibly precious daughters. Using his intimate, hard-won knowledge of the mountain's secret paths and hidden, treacherous game trails, Silas was able to slip past Quinn's blockade under the cover of darkness. He became a ghost in his own wilderness, hunting for food, gathering supplies, his movements as silent and as deadly as the mountain lion he had once tracked for 3 days. He and Marabel, now a formidable and united team, were determined to survive. He was the shield, and she was the heart of their small, defiant world. The final bloody confrontation was forced not by Quinn's patience, but by the unpredictable and often violent will of the mountain itself. A late spring blizzard, a freak, monstrous storm of incredible ferocity, descended upon the Snowhorns, trapping everyone, besiegers and besieged alike, in a world of blinding, swirling white. The wind screamed with the force of a physical blow, and the temperature plummeted. Quinn and his men, caught in the open with inadequate shelter, were forced to make a desperate final push up the mountain, seeking the shelter of the very cabin they had come to destroy. The battle that followed was a brutal, desperate, and chaotic affair, fought not in a clear, open field, but in the heart of the raging elemental fury of the storm. It was a chaotic swirl of snow and wind and the bright, ugly flashes of gunfire. Silas, no longer a hermit but a ranger once more, used his tactical skills and his profound knowledge of the mountain to defend their makeshift home. He fought not with the cold, detached fury of a soldier, but with the desperate, protective ferocity of a father and a husband, a man who had already lost one family and would rather die than lose another. Just as they were about to be overrun, their ammunition running low, their strength finally failing against the superior numbers, a new, unexpected, and powerful force entered the fray. A group of Shoshone warriors, their forms appearing like avenging spirits out of the blinding, swirling snow, descended on Quinn's men. They were led by the wise and powerful Chief Black Moon, the leader of the local tribe. He and his warriors had been tracking Quinn's hostile movements for weeks, their own scouts having been alerted by the sacrilegious presence of armed, trespassing men so close to their sacred lands. The chief recognized the intricately beaded bracelet that Silas now wore openly on his wrist, a gift from his late wife, Black Moon's own cousin, and he and his warriors recognized the crescent moon birthmarks on the ankles of the three small children, a sacred and unmistakable sign of their shared bloodline. The tables were not just turned, they were utterly, completely, and violently overturned. Joseph Quinn and his hired guns, caught between the ranger's deadly rifle, the fury of the storm, and the silent, lethal arrows of the Shoshone warriors, were defeated. In the final desperate moments of the fight, Quinn, his face a mask of insane, thwarted rage, made a last suicidal lunge for Marabel, who stood in the cabin doorway, shielding her children. But Silas was there first. The shot from the ex-ranger's pistol was the final definitive sound in the sudden quiet stillness of the snow-filled clearing. In the aftermath of the battle, with the storm finally beginning to break and a pale, watery sun appearing through the clouds, Chief Black Moon stood before the small, battered cabin. He did not ask for the children to be returned to his tribe, as was his right. He saw the deep, undeniable, and sacred bond that had been forged between Silas, Marabel, and the three small girls. He saw not a white man, a half-breed woman, and three children. He saw a family forged in the crucible of survival, courage, and love. He placed his hand on Silas's shoulder, a gesture of profound respect and acceptance. He declared Silas he who keeps promises, and in an act that would become a legend in the territory, a story told around campfires for generations, he recognized their small, brave family as the rightful and true guardians of the sacred land that bordered their own, a living, breathing, and powerful bridge between two peoples. The story ends a year later. The cabin has been rebuilt, stronger now, with a new sun-filled room added for the girls. A vibrant, sprawling garden, a testament to Marabel's patient and loving hands, blooms where the snowdrifts once lay. Silas and Marabel stand on the porch watching their three daughters, their hair a beautiful mixture of dark and sun-streaked brown, chasing butterflies in the warm spring sunlight. They are no longer defined by their losses, by their bloodlines, or by the ghosts of their past. They are defined by the new, strong, and beautiful family they have forged together, a promise once broken and mourned, now finally and completely fulfilled in the heart of the wild. Of course, here is the reflection on the themes of the Granger's promise and the concluding call to action for the video, written in our established style. The Granger's promise is a powerful story that reminds us that our true family is not always the one we are born into, but the one we have the courage to build. Silas Granger was a man defined by a profound loss, a ghost haunting the ruins of a past he couldn't prevent. He retreated into the wilderness, believing that solitude was the only safe harbor in a world that had taken everything from him. His story is a poignant reflection of how grief can become a prison, convincing us that the safest path is to never risk our hearts again. Marabel's journey is one of incredible resilience in the face of unimaginable cruelty. She was cast out, condemned, and left to die for a reason that defied all logic and decency. The world had judged her and her children as worthless, yet even at her lowest point, her spirit was not broken. Her first words to Silas were not for herself, but for her daughters. She is a testament to the fierce, primal, and unbreakable power of a mother's love, a force that can endure even the cruelest of winters. What makes their story so deeply resonant is that their healing began with a choice that defied all the prejudices of their time. Silas, a man haunted by the loss of his own native family, saw a reflection of his own tragedy in Marabel and her children. His decision to save them was not just an act of kindness, it was an act of redemption. In protecting them, he was trying to fulfill the promise he had failed to keep to his own wife. He was attempting to rewrite the ending to his own tragic story. This is a profound lesson for our own lives. We often carry the weight of our past failures, believing they are a permanent part of who we are. But this story suggests that sometimes the universe gives us a second chance, not to erase the past, but to honor it by making a different choice in the present. The family they forged was not bound by traditional lines of blood or race, but by a shared history of loss and a shared vow of protection. It teaches us that the strongest homes are not built from timber or stone, but from the promises we choose to keep to one another. It's a powerful reminder that we are not defined by the families we've lost, but by the ones we have the courage to create in the face of a cold and unforgiving world. And so, on a lonely mountain where a family was once lost, a new one was found. A haunted ex-ranger and a resilient mother discovered that the deepest bonds are not forged in blood, but in the promises we make to protect each other through the longest, coldest winters. Thank you for braving the storm with us here at Wild West Secrets. If this story of second chances, fierce parental love, and a family forged against all odds warmed your heart, then you have found your home with us. We are dedicated to telling the stories of the quiet heroes and the profound connections that lit up the darkest corners of the American frontier. To help us keep these fires burning, please take a moment to like this video and share it with someone who believes that family is more than just blood. And if you never want to miss another secret we uncover, be sure to subscribe and ring that notification bell. Now we want to hear from you. Leave a comment below and tell us, what do you think was the most powerful promise in this story? Silas's vow to protect, or Marabel's vow to survive? Until our next story, may you have the courage to keep your own promises, and may you always find warmth in the shelter of the family you choose. Stay safe out on the trail.